Welcome to the Great Things LLC podcast, the show that celebrates people who are making an impact on the world, people creating conscious businesses that are in alignment with their own personal values. Each episode shares the wisdom, experience, and the intentions of those that are following their dreams. Visionaries who have chosen a different path, found their purpose, and create joy and abundance while helping others. Whether you're already a trailblazer or still searching for your path, these stories will inspire you towards being the best version of yourself. Welcome, listeners. Today's podcast is one that hits very close to the heart, and it has something that all of us experience throughout our lifetime, and it is talking about grief, bereavement, loss, and healing from that. Today's guest is a good friend and just a wonderful gentleman. It is Dr. Kent Tonkin. Kent, welcome to the program.
Oh, Josh, thanks so much for having me.
So Kent, we'll just give the credentials here a little bit. So you are an assistant professor at the St. Francis University with the School of Business, and I see you have dual appointments in both the Human Resource Management and MIS system. You're also a phenomenal musician for one of my favorite bands, Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. So you've done a lot, but here we are today, and you are seated at the college office there.
Yeah, I'm here in my office today. I'll be meeting with students when we're done with our interview today.
Let's just start this discussion by identifying what is grief, because it's different for so many and how it touches people.
Well, grief often gets lumped in with the world of mental illness. And the important thing to realize is grief is not a mental illness. Grief is a natural response to loss. Now, as you aptly state, everybody experiences grief in a different way. Sometimes grief can go for longer periods for different people. It never gets the title of mental illness until it starts to become an impediment to your normal functioning over a long period of time. It's natural. It's part of life because everybody and everything dies. And so how we respond to it is really up to us individually. And again, it's something that we don't really integrate well into our daily lives in Western culture.
And grief, while we're talking about specifically here today, the bereavement process and the policies around that, grief can also come in a lot of different forms. It is from the loss of a loved one. It can be from the loss of a relationship. It could be from a change of career or a bad health diagnosis. It could be literally moving on to a better place in life because you're grieving what's known. So while it comes in different forms, sometimes that process may feel similar. Would you feel the same on that?
I completely agree. And I think right now in 2022, the reason we're all so cognizant of grief, people quite literally have lost loved ones during the course of the pandemic. But at the same time, we're also grieving the lives we had before when we could just go out and do anything we wanted without really thinking about it. Going to a concert, going to a shopping mall, eating dinner, those things are things we don't take for granted now because we lost them or had them modified for such a long time.
Yeah, thank you. I feel that, and I think that's a piece that's missed. But let's talk about, we'll share both of our stories because you and I parallel on some things, on some loss. So let's start at the beginning, Kent. You suffered a lot of loss very early on. If you would share your story to give the listener some context here.
Sure. I'm very open with my background. I have a twin brother. We were estranged from our father. Our mother and father were not married. And my father passed when I was about 6. I have no memory of him. And his place was filled by an uncle who became like a surrogate father to me. My uncle passed when I was in 7th grade, followed 2 years later by my mother. And so then my grandmother, who had been our caregiver and the person who had filled in for my mom, passed when I was a year out of college. And by the time I went between the ages of 6 and 22, other than my brother, everybody who was in the house I had grown up with had passed away. And so we really experienced a lot of loss very quickly. Some of the complications from that, I mean, obviously loss is tough. But when you're going through the 1980s, before we had greater awareness of integrating these kinds of experiences, I remember during none of these losses did anybody in my school administration ever talk to me. A counselor never talked to us. We were never put into any kind of program. The best I recall is our family doctor, when my mom passed, offering my brother and I tranquilizers, not things that were proactive, but basically you can dull the pain. And what we experienced, I think, as kids were my brother got into a lot of destructive behavior, led me on the path to become somebody who worked constantly, somebody who became addicted to doing more things all the time to shut down my own feelings, really derailed my personal life and my relationships because I did not have a successful shot at integrating grief until much later on in my life. What I credit to saving my existence was getting involved in volunteerism, particularly with a group called the Healing Patch, where I started working with grieving teenagers. That was the age group I was paired with, and having a chance to intervene and to work with these kids when they were in the same shoes I was in, fixed a part of my heart that I cannot even put into words sometimes. It was really what saved my life and put me on the course to being a positive person today who can talk about these things. That's a really kind of condensed version of what happened, but I walked in some weird shoes for a substantial part of my life.
I understand that, and I'll share a little of my story. One of the things that I felt the connection and the similarity is, one, being of the same age and the same generation. There wasn't the awareness, and even still today, people are uncomfortable on talking about grief. My first experience with grief or loss was my great-grandfather, who I was born on his birthday. On Father's Day, I share his name. And so we had this beautiful connection, first great-grandson, and he passed when I think I was 9 or 10. So that was the first experience. And then my father passed when I was in college and in my senior year. And the school did what they could, but there wasn't anything for the bereavement part of it. I had a unique situation where I actually had to start working and take over my father's insurance agency and complete schools. They moved my schedule around, which was tremendously helpful. So I could work 3 days a week and finish working 3 days a week to get the agency running, which was helpful, but there was no emotional support there. And then 6 years ago, I was in a relationship and my partner passed unexpectedly. And to that point, I would kind of like you, I was like, well, I buried myself in work. I was, go, 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 especially at 21. I didn't have the emotional skill sets, nor did I have the outside support. And fortunately, on this last loss with my partner, I had some really good folks around me and some really good healing modalities that helped turn and put my life into a whole different trajectory, which I'm here now. But those resources really aren't available for many out there. And there's such a distaste or like uncomfortableness being able to talk about death or loss in society or in workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, you found your healing. Your healing started by helping others in that position. So you shared your story with me, but the story of the Healing Patch is a beautiful, beautiful story. So I'd like to go into that. How did you first get introduced to that Healing Patch? Who put you in that place?
I like to say sometimes the universe has to hit you in the head pretty hard before you listen. And I had seen a flyer here at St. Francis for a group called the Healing Patch, and had kind of blown it off. I'd heard about this grief mentoring service and thought, well, that's not something I want to get involved in. And it took 2 or 3 different people mentioning it directly to me who knew my story before I finally called the coordinator and said, I'd really like to come down and see this place. I met the coordinator. Her name was Allison Stockley. And at that time, within 3 minutes of meeting her, I knew that I needed to be a part of it. Their model is not therapy. Their model is having kids split up into groups based on age and maturity. And these kids build their own peer bonds and peer networks. And the idea being kind of the model is, look, I know you're in a place similar to me. I got you. If you need to talk, I can be there for you. We as the adults in the room are facilitators. We're not counselors. We create the forum for the kids to build the connections themselves. And one of the most beautiful parts about this model, there's a separate room for the adults. If there are surviving adults, they are able to talk to other adults who are trying to raise kids as now solo caregivers in many cases, and trying to heal themselves. I've got to share this story. If this is what healing looks like, and this is what it means to heal in your community. There was a gentleman who had lost his wife and had a young daughter. And his daughter was crying before school every day because mom was no longer there to braid her hair. And the ladies in the adult room taught this man how to braid his daughter's hair. And I don't know if there's a better allegory for peer mentoring and healing than that story.
Beautiful. Like, what an awareness in a simple act. Like, you can't fix grief. You can only support the person through the process. And that's what that daughter needed. What a beautiful story. Now so you got in and you started to mentor some of these kids. There was a place where that got deeper, where you became more active within the organization itself and some fundraising.
Well, what happened was because this is a nonprofit organization, it was part at that time of a home healthcare group, and they were facing budget cuts. And a group of us knew about this. And what they were looking at cutting off at the beginning of every session, there's a communal meal. And that's so important because that's breaking bread together and saying we can have this time to get in and know each other a little before we get into the heavy lifting. And they're going to have to cut the meals. And a bunch of us got together and said, this is unacceptable. We if they're facing budget cuts, we can raise some money. We put together a concert, got a few bands together, thought we'd make $1,200 to buy a few pizzas for the year. And our first year, we raised $5,000. The second year we did it, we thought, well, we'll make $5,000 this year. And before expenses, we made $12,000. And by the third year, we had to form a nonprofit because we were moving too much money around to simply be carrying bags of money to give people to buy pizza. And that led to Patch Together Incorporated. And since 2011, since our first year when we were not officially in existence, we've now raised over $130,000 since 2011 to be able to ensure that those resources are available to kids who need them. So that's how I got into the world of nonprofit, but by necessity. We're moving too much money.
Well, not a problem that most early stage nonprofits have, so that's a good thing. How many in that time frame, what do you estimate, how many kids have you impacted or had touch points with?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say literally we're probably in the thousands at this point. And keep in mind, this is a small community. We're in small rural parts of Pennsylvania. There are two locations, one in Cambria and one in Blair County, that have large outreach. What had happened, though, Josh, over the last several years prior to COVID, the services started getting maxed out because of the high amount of opioid deaths in central PA. And after COVID hit, all of a sudden, a lot of these kids, COVID overtook opioids as the number one source of parental death. Oh. And so the services at this point, at times there are a waiting list because there's such a demand for the services. And it's really the folks who coordinate this program are doing a lot with a little.
That's amazing. So we will drop the link and information in the description here. So if this story moves you, please feel free to and encourage you to go support the Healing Patch and the great work they're doing. So we'll drop that there. Mm-hmm. So at this point, Ken, what age were you when you got involved in this? And how did you move into the education system and moving on towards ultimately the bereavement doctoral work you've done?
Well, I was in my middle 30s when I discovered the Healing Patch, and again had a series of failed relationships in my wake because of my inability to integrate grief. Got into the Healing Patch in my middle 30s, and by 2011, actually right before I turned 40, is when we started doing the fundraising piece. And it kind of paralleled because I had a career change when I was 30. Actually, no, I was 40 years old when I started teaching. 41 actually. When I switched from working in a corporate job to teaching full time. And so it kind of paralleled in terms of the transition into the nonprofit world, the transition into teaching, and that led to doctoral work. And the work I had been doing as a volunteer kind of all of a sudden became my doctoral thesis too. The person who spurred me on, her name is Melody Ray. She's the current coordinator of the Healing Patch. And during one of our conversations said to me, well, if you're doing research involving organizations, have you ever looked at bereavement policy? And again, sometimes the universe has to hit you in the head. And I said, wow, no, I hadn't thought of that, but I probably should. And so the person who coordinates that organization that I've been supporting for over 10 years was the person who also suggested my dissertation topic.
Okay, and that dissertation topic.
Well, the dissertation topic was an exploration of the impact of workplace policy on bereavement. And so I started doing some kind of minor research to say, how big is this problem? And what I found is there's not a lot of formal research out there, but there's a lot of popular articles. You look at, any business magazine you can look at, whether it's the Society for Human Resource Management or Forbes or any of those popular business magazines. Wow, this is a real problem. The first thing that really hit me In the United States, we have the Family Medical Leave Act, which guarantees every full-time person up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to take care of themselves or somebody else who's suffering from a medical condition. If that person's loved one dies, FMLA doesn't apply anymore. In the United States, we have no required time off for bereavement. Most people in the United States will get between 2 and 5 days off for the biggest loss of their lives. And Josh, you've been through it. You know how these ripples go out in other parts of your lives. Somebody who loses a parent has to deal with an estate. In addition to the mental stress and the grief and the sorrow, minimum, it's going to take 1 to 2 years to resolve those estate issues. If you're not getting paid time off, you can't make it to government offices to be able to get things like death certificates. One of the big research studies, actually by somebody named Blackburn and Balsara, indicated that people were being re-traumatized because they were going to government offices to get death certificates because their companies wanted verification that their parent had died. And so can you imagine that? You're having to prove to your employer that you're not lying about losing somebody who is that important to you. And so that led to me doing a qualitative study. I interviewed 23 people to find out what their experiences had been like with bereavement in the workplace, how their workplaces had supported them, how the culture of the employer had supported them, how the rules of the game either applied or didn't, and how that affected their opinions of their employers. And here's kind of the big results. Your supervisor, your manager is the absolute key to all of this stuff. Many folks reported that their managers completely disregarded policy to give people more time off and flexible time. And that's kind of a good thing too, because most people didn't even know what their own bereavement policies were in their companies. So supervisors could be flexible with granting leave, discretionary leave, making sure that people had what they needed and that leave remained available over the coming year. So the supervisor is really the key person, and for reasons you might not expect. The best thing that I can also encourage employers to think about is how they are handling an employee's information when they are suffering bereavement. One of the biggest things we noted in this study was that individuals essentially who were experiencing bereavement had sort of a polar reaction to sharing in the workplace. And here's what I mean by that. There were 2 folks who participated in the study who both were at the back end of an all-staff email informing everybody about what had happened to them. One person thought it was the greatest thing ever because it was a gateway to more support from coworkers who would stop and check on them. The other person felt their privacy had been completely violated because they did not want to grieve at work. They did not want to bring that to work. They wanted to treat their workplace and office as a place of respite, not a place where they would grieve. And the employer's actions and sharing and several other things ultimately led to that individual leaving their employment because of the way they've been treated. So it's really in the supervisor's power to say to someone when they're going through this terrible event, let us know how you want this handled so that we can honor your wishes. And so those are some of the big findings. There's lots of findings in the study, but the biggest one ultimately is your supervisor will more often than not determine the experience you have with bereavement at work.
So from a company perspective, that is probably one of the key touch points for employee retention, satisfaction, job satisfaction, and long-term loyalty. There's all the ancillary benefits, but there's that human aspect. And the piece that you brought up on that 2 polar reactions is something that is, if you've been through grief, you can understand it, but sometimes you don't know what you need, but you know what you don't like. And to have someone there, because grief is such a wide emotional process, sometimes people in grief can't feel it. And to have someone there that has a little bit of training or the ability to ask questions and to listen and to be present without trying to fix it, I think is one of the big pieces that is missing just in personal interactions, but certainly in the business. So it is the supervisor's direct impact. From the supervisor perspective, we talked about this a little bit. How do you train a supervisor? Because this is an uncomfortable place for a lot of people to speak. So in getting a better bereavement
process within a company, what are some of the things that employers can do to support their staff and their supervisors in delivering it?
I think that the companies should start looking at this as something that should be reinforced, maybe even on an annual basis. Every year, good companies do things like sexual harassment training. They do training for compliance for a variety of things, depending on the industry. And yet we don't talk about grief. And that's something that's going to appear literally in every single workplace, regardless of industry. So giving managers even a script to follow, and I know that sounds maybe a little cold, but an idea being, when something happens, when you find out that an employee is dealing with a bereavement or a loss, these are the questions you should ask, and this is the way you should interact with that person. Not everybody can be made to be comfortable with those conversations, but the person who is suffering the loss, I think, based on my research, will remember that at least somebody in the organization took the time to ask them what their wishes were, to go through the process, to let them know what was available to them, and to step in and help them through the process, or conversely, to put their hands off if that's what the employee wants. I mean, I think the one thing that employers probably also need to look at is to have managers who are aware when we're looking at a safety issue. For example, if you were in a factory environment or a high stress environment or a medical environment, is somebody who is dealing with a loss mentally capable of being in that work environment without putting themselves or others at risk? And so that would vary by work environment. The other thing I would mention, there's a new and emerging industry that's coming out now called grief coaching. And that's essentially teaching people how to be better at helping others grieve. There's a subset of that's, I think, fantastic. It's corporate grief coaching. So we actually have people who are going out into the workplaces, consulting with employers and saying, this is what should be in your policy. This is what should be in your training. This is how you can make sure these issues don't occur. And I think the reason employers are open to listening to this right now, the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics stats, right now our labor force participation rate in terms of 100% of Americans who could work, we're about 63%. And the unemployment rate of that 63% is about 4%. So we're talking about 4% of 63% of the population that can't find a job. What that means, it's an employees market. It's tough to get good people. And if you're looking at an employment and retention standpoint, you as an employer, this is another tool in your toolbox to ensure those good people who are coming to work for you will stay, because they'll remember the kindness you showed them.
Don't want to boil it down to the simple things, but it is about doing the right thing, and the right thing pays dividends for the employer and for the employee, that long term, that customer or the employee appreciation. I've seen people in different circumstances where when they've had an incredible employer that steps up for them in a moment of crisis or need, that person will stay there even through better job offers, because the loyalty and the attachment they have to those folks. With the those corporate grief counselors, or do they just help set policy, or are they also available for a company to bring in times of employee loss or grief?
It's kind of one of those industries that's sort of going through the storming, forming, norming phase, and the fact that there are pockets of this profession all over the country right now, and they run the gamut. For example, one of my colleagues really truly does the corporate thing, where she goes in and consults with companies and is helping them set policy and doing direct training with managers. So that's a very limited subset. To be honest with you, it's a field I'd like to get into because it's new and emerging. But then we go to the other extreme. There are individuals who will train people how to do one-on-one grief coaching, even at an individual that has nothing to do with work. So it really is a new and emerging discipline, and something that companies are only now starting to see the value of. So it's a great field to get into right now.
If a CEO or some sort of leadership is listening right now, from an employer standpoint, what are the one or two things that they could do to help start developing the bereavement policy within their organization? What would you suggest employers do if they have a gap in this area currently?
Well, I would say that, and this is really boiling it down, I would say two things. Number one, look for some of the resources that are already out there. I work with a group called Evermore, who is a nonprofit who is doing government level advocacy for bereavement policy. But on Evermore's website, they have a number of policy recommendations and documents you can get for free that will give you a starting point. The second part of it, I would say, is talk with your employees, whether it's putting together a committee, whether it's talking to your managers. Get people together who aren't going through this yet to talk about what should be your policy, what should be your approach, what is the best way to ensure that all your employees know what your policies are. In reality, the research backs up that most people don't honestly abuse bereavement policy. And I think so many employers are just concerned if they are generous with those policies that people will try to get time off repeatedly. And there will be those folks, but it's not the majority of people who are dealing with this loss. Those are my two biggest recommendations.
Touching a little bit on Evermore, that's a good segue. There's also some work that you're following or participating in on not just the policy side, but the legislative side. So what needs to happen from our legislative and regulatory environment to support bereavement in the workplace?
I think that the folks on what my research indicated is that the folks on the lower rungs of the employment ladder, people maybe who are new employees or not as well established in organizations, and to be blunt, people who are more entry level employees are the ones who suffer the most. And I think that what might really help from a policy standpoint, the ideal would be nationally required paid bereavement leave. In the absence of that happening, because it's a tough pill to swallow to ask government to require more days off for a lot of people, even more flexibility with the Family Medical Leave Act, so that established policy that we're all very familiar with and the companies know how to mandate. I think those sorts of things could be adapted. The Family Medical Leave Act could be adapted to allow time off for bereavement too. So I think maybe we need to look at compromise between those two extremes. I think paid bereavement leave at the federal level will be fantastic, but I think as a great second option, some modification at FMLA would make a lot of sense.
Even at the paid federal level, I believe you spoke, there's really only one country that actually has federalized bereavement policy, which was shocking to me to hear.
If you ever get a chance to meet this lady, her name is Lucy Hurd, and she is a warrior. She got paid bereavement leave passed through Parliament in the UK. The UK is currently the only country in the world that has required bereavement leave for parents who either lose a pregnancy or a child, and it was named Jack's Law after her son Jack, who tragically died in an accident. And so she is a warrior, and she's an example for the rest of the world of what can happen.
That's amazing. Sometimes it just takes one passionate person to ignite that movement.
He is fierce.
With all this information and the positive side, we haven't really touched on how the lack of or poor bereavement policy can have just disastrous impacts for the person and for the employer. Any examples of what not to do?
Well, the old vernacular is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think the best example I can think of that in my research, there was an individual who had lost her father and had returned to work. After returning to work, she was asked by her supervisor to come to a meeting where the entire staff had gathered, and in front of the entire staff presented her with a father-daughter figurine to commemorate her father's loss. And that was ultimately what drove her to leave the company she worked for, because she had specifically asked that her loss not be fussed over in the workplace, that she had been not put in a situation to be on display, and they did the exact opposite of what she asked for. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like, especially being in that raw emotional place.
Yeah.
That to me is the best example I can think of how to completely disregard your employees' feelings.
Also feels like there's probably some liability opened up from an employment standpoint. That's sharing private information when you were told, requested not to.
I think the reason we don't see more of that is probably because people are in such a raw emotional place. They're more likely just to leave and to say, rather than open that wound a little more deeply, what we're going to do is just walk away.
Yeah.
In fact, the other story I would say, this is a controversial topic, but the story needs to be told because we need more research on this aspect. One individual who participated in my study had suffered several miscarriages at work, not during work, but while she was working. Her employer refused to acknowledge her miscarriage as a loss. And again, that gets into the controversy surrounding reproductive rights in this country right now. But she was denied leave, and her supervisor even instructed her the type of abortive procedure that she thought she should have. And so was telling her how to terminate a pregnancy and how to handle her loss. Now, her particular spiritual and religious beliefs meant that she needed to carry the pregnancy to term and to deliver. When she returned from what leave she was able to cobble together from paid time off and sick leave, she was put on a performance improvement plan because her supervisor had known that while she was dealing with a miscarriage, her performance levels had dropped off. And so the takeaway message there is, regardless of the controversy we're in right now with things like reproductive rights, the employer's response of giving that individual latitude to make their own decisions ultimately would have kept that person at the company. She ended up leaving because of the way she had been treated, and it was a company for which she had been recruited heavily. And so the message there is, give people latitude in deciding what's important to them.
It's just almost hard to hear that story. It just, the lack of humanity, the lack of compassion, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
And there's also the place you touched on too earlier, that employers have a responsibility to the safety and the productivity of the rest of the company and their clients. So it's when we spoke offline, I really appreciated your approach to the balance side of the employer as well. So it's not like they get everything they need, but there is a way in a discussion. So how do you see the employers and the supervisors in those situations where someone is experiencing deep grief and loss, and their performance may suffer for a little while? It's normal. That was my experience. You just can't get your head in the game, nor should you, because you should be healing. So how from an employment standpoint do you balance that line with employee care and business requirements?
Well, obviously there can't be carte blanche, because sooner or later people have to get back to work. We have to do what we have to do. I think that employers, however, need to be a little bit more hands-on and individualized with their approaches to this stuff. There might be the one extreme person whose grief is so debilitating that maybe they'll never come back and be who they were before, and that happens. Unfortunately, that person may need to start over somewhere else, and I know that's an unfortunate reality to talk about. But most people probably will fall out in some place less than that. And the same level of patience that employers have had to apply over the last 2 years during COVID, where we had to scramble sometimes to find people to staff organizations and to be present on site, I think that what we're dealing with here is probably not as bad as that. So the lessons we've learned in terms of a little more flexibility and humanity, even in large, very rigid work environments, we need to apply here. And sometimes that also means large organizations may have to adjust their ideas of performance too, simply because we've already seen that in the last 2.5 years of our lives. So that's not a great answer, because it's not something that's a hard and fast answer. But I think also, if you get into grief coaching within organizations, that greater awareness will really assist companies in being more flexible. Just the very fact that managers might actually be a little more involved in this process means we can have a more individualized response to get people back at work when they're ready and when it's safe for them to be there.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that, on the grief process, it's not a linear process either. So to get the employers and employees themselves to recognize that there's an intensity in the initial stages, then there's kind of a lull, and then you get those days, or those special anniversaries that will creep up and, just catch you out of nowhere. Or it could be a sight or a sound or a smell. We could be having a great day. So the process of grief is an ongoing process.
Yep. The funny thing about it is, one of the worst things to happen in the world of grief are open office spaces. And in fact, Bauer and Murray did this great study. And one of the biggest problems we have is that people in many modern office layouts don't even have a private place to go when they are having one of those days. So I'm lucky. I've got an office. If somebody in an open office layout, much grieving is done in modern America in bathrooms because there's no place else to go to be able to lose it, not in front of somebody.
Right. Well, Ken, thank you for taking the time and for the work that you're doing. Congratulations on defending and getting that doctorate out there. Get those coveted initials. And just closing, anything else you'd like to share with the audience, or tips for employers or employees, anyone experiencing grief? How would you like to finish up here?
I think I want to leave the audience with one final point. Nobody's good at grief. Nobody is an expert at grief. If you find yourself wondering what to say to somebody who has lost somebody, the best advice I can give you, go to them and tell them that you're there. They may not call on you. They may not call you. They may not stop and see you. But simply telling somebody, hey, I'm here. I acknowledge your loss. And if you need me, however you need me, I'll be there for you. That's the best thing in the world you can do for somebody. The two worst things you can do are to tell somebody you know how they feel, because grief is so individually focused. And the second is to just avoid someone. And unfortunately, because we're uncomfortable with grief, sometimes when people need us the most, that's when we tend to walk away from them. And it doesn't mean we're bad people. It means it's something we don't know how to do.
Right. Beautiful sentiments. And I'm going to add one small piece to that is, in my view and my experience with grief, is to give someone who's grieving a lot of grace. They may not be acting how they normally do. You can't be in their shoes. So give them some grace, show up, as you said, and just be there. That's beautiful. We need more of that in the world here.
I agree. And Josh, thanks so much for sharing your story too, by the way.
Yeah. It's it doesn't define you, but it certainly steals the makeup a little bit. And looking back, you can survive it. You can be stronger, and you can turn grief from an overwhelming, debilitating loss and sad depth to something that is beautiful. And it's not negating the loss, it's actually honoring it. So I appreciate the story. Kent, thank you again. And I look forward to seeing you. If you are out in the Western Pennsylvania area, or if they're touring, I do suggest definitely catch Jim Donovan in the Sun King Warrior, so you can see Kent in his other natural environment. And please do check out some of the links here for the organizations that Kent's mentioned. Support where you can, and open this discussion with your employees and employers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Great Things LLC podcast. If you did, be sure to share the link with this episode with your friends, and share it to your social media with your biggest takeaway, tagging me at Great Things LLC. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. There's so much more to come. You can support me by leaving a rating and a review of the show, and that will help others to find their purpose, dream, collaborate, and create their own success story. Until next time, this is Josh Meter, your host, signing off.